Hey, so today I'm gonna talk a little bit about slavery from a global perspective and sort of going into gray, murky waters. I don't know everything about it, but I want to talk about it and consider it in the terms of development, economic development, uh, and the role of slavery, and try to think about it in in a model, or at least talk about ideas that could be put into sort of a model because I've looked around. I haven't quite found anything that approaches slavery that way. I know. I think it's a depressing topic. It's hard to think about. It can feel very overwhelming to think about, but of course, it's much worse to actually be a slave than to think or learn about it and try to analyze it. So why not talk a little bit about it? So here's some books I've read, just real quick. Five books I've read about slavery. Other books discuss it, but these ones are the main focus. So this one's Africans in America, America's Journey Through Slavery. So it goes through the Atlantic slave trade to uh, American history with slavery up to the Civil War. This one's The Slave Ship, A Human Story by Marcus Rediker. So this talks this vividly details what the Atlantic slave trade was like, and then talks about the British, what led to them abolishing slavery because they were the first Western European power to do so, and then eventually other places, the U.S. and France later, after Napoleon was defeated, the Treaty of Vienna. I think that's when it started to kind of get enforced in Europe, and then later, of course, the Civil War in America, and then Brazil in 1888, I think, was the last major country to ban slavery. This is the other slavery, which is about Native Americans or Indians getting enslaved, and so sort of that includes parts of the American West. So we're not exclusively talking about blacks or African enslavement. Okay, so and then here are the two ones that I was really interested in, which is this one's Global Slavery by Jeremy Black, and it only has one chapter on ancient slavery, which is kind of what I was interested in. Maybe I should look into maybe things about Roman slavery. I don't know. And I think this one is a more kind of British focused, I would say, as I recall reading it. Look at the role of slavery, and it's a little bit newer than this other one, which is Slavery, A World History by Milton Meltzer. And, so what I have to say is, I looked through, I didn't come across a lot of books that really try to analyze slavery or think about it in sort of an economic model. Now there's some tricky parts. Like today we talk about it's slavery is illegal in every country. If you're part of the UN, no country has it, but there's always a black market. Slavery still exists. There's forced labor, and we can think about in terms of how slavery is, how you would define it, and different roles of slavery. There's sex trafficking workers versus people that work in, a mine that are enslaved versus, the domestic worker. There's different types of forced labor. Something I think about, you think about freedom. Freedom's an ambiguous term, in America where I live. Everyone's talking about freedom. Everyone loves freedom. what does freedom really mean? You're not, is it freedom as long as you don't impose, hurt someone else? But what, I would like to, it's kind of vague though, like in terms of how you contrast slavery versus freedom. And so I like to think about it in terms of maybe choice. Like, do people have choices or do they not have choices? And of course, some things people don't have choices in, like death and taxes or something like that. You're going to have to pay your taxes, pay your dues somehow or something like that. There's a whole complex thing that we're getting into. But slavery, slavery is not having a choice. So let's talk about it from the global framework of like global history, because you read a lot of history books, they're all just about like kings and presidents and the decision makers or whatever like that, who makes the choices and the powerful people. But, the bulk of the population is not that. In some of these societies, the bulk of the population are enslaved people. And the society has had lots of slaves throughout history. You can look at the Roman Empire that was built around slavery. Same with the ancient Mesopotamia. Same with ancient Greece, tons of slaves. Egypt had slaves, ancient Egypt, but it was not so central. Now, everyone was beholden to the pharaoh. So, you go back to these ancient times, and I've even heard the argument that, if we didn't have slavery, that, it wouldn't give this sort of provide for a leisurely class to, invent ideas and, build things. Now, I wouldn't say that. Like, I think if you believe that, like, innovation comes from, like, Einstein geniuses, perhaps, but the reality is, from what I understand, is that innovation comes from not so much that. It comes from, like, having a lot of exposure to ideas. So, innovations tend to come from, say, a city center or something like that, where people are bringing lots of ideas and then people can work over those ideas and innovate them. But having a centralized power structure, such as, I don't know, a king or some sort of despot or something like that, who maybe controls a bunch of slaves and can command them what to do, is that once those innovations are realized, they can institute them on a large macro scale. So everyone is following the rules. If you have a sort of decentralized zone where everyone's kind of doing their own thing and there's no clear rules, or, not everyone's using the same currency or weights and measures, things are inefficient or whatever, but, you have one centralized system where everyone follows the same rules. That's, the advantage of centralization. And I think centralization, now this is just, I'm spitballing theories here, but I think centralization does seem to have something to do with the way slavery works. Now, I could be wrong. Like I said, I haven't read anything that's like goes through and analyzes like the role of labor structures in society and like puts it together like, in sort of this Aristotelian model. And so, with slave labor, when we think about those things, I think one thing with, like, say, Mesopotamia or Greece or Rome, I mean, there is this role of violence. So it's, you acquire slaves through war captives. These central authorities or whatever, these, stationary bandits that are acquiring a monopoly of force, they go capture another group of people and then they take all the captives and make them their slaves. And that's, so there's sort of this violent structure. Now, this is speculation, but, the Indus River Valley system, where they have, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, or the Harappan culture, they don't know much. Archaeologists don't know a whole lot about that society. What they do know is that the floor plans seem to be relatively the same size, suggesting that they don't have a lot of social hierarchy. And they also had plumbing and dentists. If I had to pick an ancient civilization to live in, not to say any were great, I would, take my chances with the Indus River Valley system. Honestly, they seemed a little bit better than, say, like the Shang Dynasty, where they had lots of slaves, or uh, you know, a, the Assyrians or something like that. Uh, because, but we don't know much about them. Sometimes history, the people that look the best are the people that you know the least about. So let's take it all the way back to like hunter gatherers. In hunter gatherer societies, it's like about units of about like 20, 30 people, and they all live together. They live mobily, so there's no property. It's not like the economic, or laws. The law, 9/10 of the law is property. Well, they don't have laws in hunter-gatherer societies. And people want to survive based off of, so what's the best means of survival? It's not being the strongest or something like that. It's actually, working, having the strongest group. Your group helps you. Uh, if you take down a beast or something like that, and you have a bunch of food, it's gonna rot before you can eat it all. So you share it with other people, and then you develop this reciprocity so that they help you later. That's who you invest in. One thing I read that was kind of interesting. It was in this book, The People's History of Poverty in America. They talked about, it's kind of like uh, they talk a lot about like a different psychology of like if you grow up in poverty. And I don't want to make any generalizations about these sorts of things, but they talk about like when you have extra wealth, you invested in sort of developing social capital. So, you have extra wealth, you throw a party and have a bunch of people, come and celebrate because they'll get you back later, sort of thing. You don't invest it in the stock market, you invest it in the people around you, which, it seems like the natural way, actually, that people invest in. But, in a big centralized system where, things get more and more depersonalized, that's where you have more of these layers of these groups of underclass people, slaves. So how do we get there from hunter-gatherers to, where, you live in a small group where it's relatively egalitarian to these big systems with lots of people. Now, you could read a lot of things about the Neolithic Revolution and the rise of agriculture and growth in population, but I want to talk about a couple key components. So one is about domination, human, because that is the question. There's the master and the slave. So as I talked about in like hunter-gatherer societies, it's like everyone in that group is interdependent. Their success is dependent on your success. And of course, the master and the slave, it's not an equal relationship, but it's still interdependent. There's still, the slave is beholden to the master, and, the master gives them enough food to live so they can work another day, and and the master benefits. So, this book is called Sex and War, and this is about biology explains warfare and terrorism. And of course, it's about domination. And they talk about how chimps, they have these male aggression teams. So, in a hunter-gatherer band, yeah, you love everyone in your circle, but if they're outside the circle, you probably don't love them. You probably fear them and might attack them. And so they talk about these other, in chimp societies, which are our closest living relative, they go attack another chimp group, kill people of their own species. Then they take, it's basically explained where, these ideas of rape and violence within species to species, happen, and how people get dominated, where domination comes from. But of course, in hunter-gatherer societies, it's probably not like, they don't have farm plots where they need everyone working in salt mines or picking cotton or something like that to be enslaved. So where is this, but we can see this relationship of where domination comes from, where we're having power over someone else comes from through violence and force. But of course, does that lead to a better society? Does it say, hey, we have all these slaves, so that leaves some specialized people to invent, the time to be creative and create these innovations? I don't think so, like I said earlier. And I want to point out this book, which I talked about in a different video. I know this video is getting long. I'll try to keep it kind of short. And it's the British Revolution from a global perspective. And, one of the things they talk about is like labor-saving technology. So it's actually because, like the Industrial Revolution happened because labor was expensive in Britain. So they invented technology to lay people off. So they didn't have to hire so many people. So if you have a bunch of slaves, which don't cost anything, you're probably not going to invent new innovations. You're not going to be motivated. You're just going to be like, I need some more slaves. I'll go start another war or something like that. Who can I capture and turn into a slave? So I tend to think that, having a large oppressed class does not lead to a society that's creating great innovations. I think it actually kind of stagnates and perpetuates violent culture. Now, there could be some academic historian that disagrees with me, and they can have some great points. I really don't know much about this subject. What I can say is that some other things, of what sort of incentivizes people, because you think like, oh, we can all live in a better world, and how do you get everyone to agree with everything? So, there is this question of people, being too much of like this big mass of people that can't agree on everything or don't understand everything. They don't have the same sets of cultural norms or whatever. They don't respect a common thing. And can you do that through education, rather like educate people on why they should be following all the same rules so we can live peacefully or whatever together versus dominate them and force them to do things like work in a salt mine or something like that. So the last book I'm going to just talk about, this book's called The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and it's by Samuel Moyn. And so this book talks about really how human rights really didn't they talk sometimes about, I think it was 1948, the Human Rights Commission, but it was kind of different than, when we think of national rights, so like in the French Revolution, the rights of man, or when we talk about the abolition movement. Those aren't quite human rights, those are based on national rights. So when we think about human rights, he's Moyne's saying it basically started in the 1970s, and it was kind of advocated by Amnesty International, and that's sort of leading into where we're getting to with slavery, and there's still tons of slavery. Every once in a while, you hear things like, "Oh, these shrimp farmers are enslaved, so don't buy shrimp," and it only gets so much attention. Something else I want to just say real quickly before I end. I know I didn't really talk a whole lot. It was just a couple random ideas because there's nothing definitive to say about it. Of course, we all think slavery's terrible, and why think about it? Except that the fact that it exists and it still exists. And I know people sometimes they try to say why should we? People complain about, yada, yada, yada. Why do they complain about, slavery in America from 100 years ago or something like that when it's all around the other countries and the world and stuff? But I'm what I would say is it's not very well understood. And, it's difficult to read these things sometimes, but we actually benefit, from learning about it, at least as the silver lining of learning about it from American history, and understanding it, and understanding that when you think about generational progression and how families develop and what they're dealing with, But I think in a lot of ways, this is my own 2 cents, is that America, we need to understand, though, of course, American slavery fits in a larger global context. Now, that's not to say, oh, don't complain, because at least you're not living in Haiti or something like that. I think, or Angola, like it's this contest of who had it the worst. I wouldn't wish anyone to be a slave. I think it's a horrible thing. And there's, not anything that, it's not like a contest of who had it the worst. It's all bad. So, I just wanted to kind of end with that, because it's sort of like, it's not really about trying to say something like, oh, well, aren't you glad, like, you were enslaved in America? It's like, no. Like, I mean, actually, in a lot of ways, American slavery was very bad. There was other one. This is how I put it. Sometimes it's like it's comparing like a shit sandwich. Do you want to eat a shit sandwich or a dirt sandwich? Obviously, you'd eat a dirt sandwich, but you don't want to eat a dirt sandwich, right? And we don't need to get into this whole contest of what's worse. It's all bad, all right? But I'm gonna say, there was this the Spanish system did have a certain degree of legal rights, and there was a process where the Catholic Church now, I don't want, like I said, I don't want to make it like overly like, oh, this is a great form of slavery or something like that, or something like that, or But there are, obviously there's different rules in different societies of like whether they're customary or legal of what you can do to your slave. Now, I think we should say that it's not a good thing. And I feel like just saying all this stuff, I'm like, not saying anything significant. I don't have much more to say. So I'm going to end it here, but I just wanted to say we should talk about it. We should understand it instead of just like, just think in terms of like, our own privileges or whatever like that, the things we take for granted, and keep it in context. I'm not trying to say like that you can't have struggles or hardship. It's just to understand it in the context of the very big world that we live in. And I probably didn't do any of these, talking about any of this stuff, justice. Obviously, there's no justice when you're talking about slavery.